It's tempting to moralize, to say power corrupts or love conquers, or that kings should just mind their paperwork. But maybe the more honest ending is this. Royal mistresses were never really about romance. They were about reflection. Each one mirrored her era, its vanity, its politics, its definition of what women were allowed to be. From Diane de Poitiers glowing faintly with gold dust, to Alice Keppel waving politely at her lover's funeral, to Wallis Simpson photographed forever in exile. They all lived the same paradox, adored and disposable, visible and erased. And when the king finally died, they were left to navigate the quiet. The space between history's footnotes and its fairy tales. Let's stay here for a moment, in that quiet, just before sleep, where candlelight fades and gossip turns into memory. Because in the final part, we'll drift gently backward again, to the beginning. To trace how the idea of royal love without legitimacy shaped art, politics, and maybe even the way we think about fame itself. No guillotines, no headlines, just echoes, portraits, and the faint sound of someone closing a very heavy door at the end of a reign. The details don't need revisiting here, too loud, too recent, not very sleepy, but the pattern held. Love, power, outrage, exile. A cycle that had been running quietly since medieval times, now televised in real time. From power to pity. What's striking about this evolution is how the emotional tone changed. For centuries, mistresses represented temptation and influence. By the modern era, they mostly inspired pity, the image of a woman cornered by headlines, losing privacy faster than jewels. The glamour was gone, only the scrutiny remained. The old-world scandals had been intimate, candlelit whispers, handwritten notes, court gossip. Modern scandals came with microphones, tabloids, and the unblinking flash of cameras. It's oddly comforting, in a way, to realize that history managed to recycle the same moral drama, just with better lighting. Back to the theme, what happens after the king dies? So, let's bring the pattern home one more time. When the king dies, everything stops. Titles shift, uniforms change, and the mistress, whoever she is, in whatever century, finds herself on the wrong side of ceremony. The 20th century didn't change that truth, it just made the silence public. Some mistresses reinvented themselves as philanthropists or actresses. Some married quietly and disappeared. Some, inevitably, kept giving interviews they probably regretted. But all of them faced the same cold transition, from being central to invisible. History tends to erase women once their usefulness ends. Royal mistresses simply experienced that erasure in high definition. The sleepy moral, if there is one. His relationship with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, wasn't technically a mistress situation by the time it reached the newspapers. But it started that way, and it ended as the most famous example of what happens when a royal refuses to let the system erase the woman he loves. Edward chose her over the throne, which was either incredibly romantic or catastrophically impractical, depending on your taste in governance. The irony? Once they married, Wallis Simpson herself became a kind of royal ghost, tolerated, occasionally photographed, never fully accepted. The crown never forgave her for existing, and the press never stopped dissecting her wardrobe. In that sense, she was the ultimate modern mistress, publicly adored, privately despised, permanently famous. Royal rehabilitation in the post-war era. After World War II, monarchy itself was in survival mode. Europe was rebuilding, republics were multiplying, and the idea of an official mistress seemed hopelessly antique. Yet the dynamics didn't disappear, they just rebranded again. Kings and princes continued to have complicated private lives, the difference was that now they were expected to apologize for them. Pensions became settlements. Exile became foreign residence. And scandal became an unfortunate personal matter. It was all the same playbook, rewritten in bureaucratic English. The press, the people, and the myth of romance. By the late 20th century, the monarchy had one new, unstoppable rival, the celebrity press. And for the first time in centuries, the mistress wasn't necessarily the villain. The public started rooting for her. When royal marriages looked cold and arranged, the idea of a genuine romance, however inappropriate, suddenly seemed sympathetic. You can see echoes of this all through the 1980s and 1990s. By the 1910s, the world was mechanized, photographed, and impatient. Romance had become correspondence, scandal had become marketing. Kings could still have mistresses, but it stopped being a private arrangement and started being a constitutional embarrassment. When King Leopold II of Belgium died in 1909, his longtime mistress Blanche Delacroix found herself suddenly stripped of property, income, and protection. The Belgian government moved swiftly to confiscate everything he had given her, palaces, jewels, even furniture, all under the banner of moral reform. She sued, of course, but public opinion was firmly against her. A century earlier she might have retired quietly, now she was front-page scandal fodder. She remarried, lived modestly, and died forgotten, her jewels scattered across auction houses. It's a tidy modern ending, bureaucratically efficient, emotionally hollow. Mistresses in an age of cameras. Let's pause for a second and notice something. By the 20th century, the mistress's tragedy wasn't exile anymore, it was visibility. Cameras democratized gossip. Before, you needed court insiders to whisper secrets. Now, all you needed was a photograph of someone standing too close to someone else. For the first time, the public could see the king's private life, and they judged accordingly. Royal mistresses went from being whispered shadows to living headlines. Every gesture was analyzed, every expression, captioned. And the older rhythm of rise and fall, affection, exile, obscurity, morphed into a new one. Rumor, denial, public statement, quiet nervous breakdown. Progress, in its own bleak way. The Edward VIII experiment. Then came Edward VIII, the king who skipped the mistress stage entirely and went straight to abdication. Her reward was peace, and, eventually, a tidy historical irony. Her great-granddaughter, Camilla Parker Bowles, would go on to marry another future king with an equally complicated romantic history. So yes, the Keppel genes apparently come with a royal job description. The newspapers arrive. By the early 20th century, the balance between secrecy and spectacle was gone. You couldn't just vanish quietly, photographers followed. Editors realized that a blurry photo of a royal companion sold more papers than any foreign treaty. That new visibility made mistresses both famous and doomed. Take Kiki Preston, nicknamed the Angel with the Syringe, an American socialite who became entangled with Prince George, Duke of Kent in the 1920s. Their affair was a swirl of Art Deco glamour, addiction, and whispered tragedy. When the prince died young in 1942, Kiki's life unraveled. Without the protection of royal affection, she became just another society cautionary tale. It was the modern version of exile, not a convent, but column inches. Let's drift sideways to the continent. France, as always, handled things with a bit more flair. Even after losing their monarchy, the French aristocracy still produced men who fancied themselves kings in all but title, and women who perfected the art of surviving them. In the Belle Époque, being a royal mistress shifted into being a celebrated courtesan. The line between scandal and celebrity blurred so completely that you couldn't tell whether a woman was ruined or simply fashionable. Take La Belle Otero, a Spanish dancer who charmed half of Europe's nobility, including various ex-kings, dukes, and wealthy pretenders. When her lovers died or ran out of money, Otero simply kept performing. She bought property, wrote her memoirs, and lived to 95, outliving almost everyone who had ever whispered about her. So technically, she did what all the royal mistresses never could, she made the ending hers. The last of the. Because once the camera was invented, and newspapers discovered that scandal sold faster than sermons, the quiet afterlife of a royal mistress all but vanished. In the old days, exile meant a convent. By the 19th century, exile meant front-page coverage. The Victorians, moral on paper, messy in practice. Queen Victoria's court liked to pretend that mistresses were a relic of the immoral past, something the French did, preferably behind curtains. In reality, her own sons kept the tradition alive with cheerful hypocrisy. Take Edward VII, back when he was still the eternally impatient Prince of Wales. He had a habit of collecting mistresses the way other people collected calling cards. They weren't exactly secret, just tastefully unspoken. His most famous was Lily Langtry, a Jersey-born actress with the kind of beauty that made entire dinner parties pause mid-fork. Lily was witty, well-dressed, and, crucially, didn't take herself too seriously, a refreshing change from the suffocating morality of court life. When the king eventually died, Lily didn't fade into shame or convent life. She became a professional celebrity instead, endorsing products, performing on stage, investing in property. Essentially, she monetized her past before anyone else could weaponize it. In that sense, Lily Langtry was the first royal mistress to master public relations. She didn't apologize, she simply became interesting. Alice Keppel, the polite, polished survivor. Edward's later and longer-lasting mistress was Alice Keppel, elegant, well-married, and discreet enough to be invited everywhere, including family gatherings. She was the prototype for the acceptable mistress, the one who soothed royal tempers and kept everyone civil. Even Queen Alexandra tolerated her, which says a lot about how useful Alice was in maintaining the illusion of stability. When Edward VII died in 1910, Keppel handled the transition with the same tact she'd shown in life. She wept priv. A mistress's correspondence could be both dangerous and precious, filled with secrets the crown desperately wanted to forget. So, in a sense, these women became accidental archivists of their lovers' humanity. Even if their names were later erased, their handwriting often survived. The aftermath of influence. When you look at their lives collectively, across centuries, countries, and crowns, you start to see a strange pattern. Royal mistresses were the unofficial engines of court life. They smoothed tempers, whispered advice, influenced alliances, and sometimes, in the softest way possible, changed the course of history. And yet, the moment their patron died, they were treated as if they had never existed. It's a cycle of glamour and erasure, the price of proximity to power. Some accepted it gracefully. Some fought it with lawsuits, memoirs, or sharp tongues. A few even managed to outlive and outshine the queens who once despised them. But in the end, all of them knew the same truth. Being loved by a king was a temporary job, not a lasting position. And when the music stopped, the silence was deafening. Let's linger here, in this candlelit melancholy for a moment. Because in the next part, we'll drift toward the late 19th century, the twilight of monarchy itself, where royal mistresses started facing something even worse than exile or convents. They faced newspapers. And in a world that suddenly had gossip columns, photography, and public outrage, the art of being a royal mistress became impossible to survive quietly. Velvet curtains and flashbulbs, mistresses meet the modern age. Hey again. If you're still here, congrats, you've officially outlasted about half the monarchs in this story. Let's loosen the crown a little and float into the later centuries, the era when royalty finally learned the hard way that privacy was not eternal. Just two women bound forever by one man's affections, one sanctified by the church, the other by gossip. Russia again, when the empress was the mistress. Now, if we drift back to Russia for a moment, because Russia always delivers, there's a delightful inversion of this pattern. Under Catherine the Great, the mistress became the monarch. And her lovers became the disposable ones. Catherine treated romantic succession the way most rulers treated ministerial appointments. Each favorite got a promotion, a pension, and a farewell palace. When she died in 1796, several of her former lovers were still alive, all comfortably retired, none foolish enough to make political trouble. In a way, Catherine's system was the feminist version of royal mistressing, practical, transactional, and well compensated. She'd watched how the world treated women who loved powerful men, and decided to reverse the entire equation. And history, predictably, still found a way to call her immoral. Mistresses as memory keepers. There's another quiet side to this story, one rarely mentioned. When a king died, his mistresses often became the last people who truly remembered him as a person. The courtiers turned him into ceremony. The historians turned him into propaganda. But the mistress remembered his small talk, his bad moods, his ridiculous habits. It's not romantic, exactly, but it's human. Some of them even preserved those memories in letters, diaries, and portraits that historians later stumbled across. She retreated to her estates, rewrote her own version of events in a set of very opinionated memoirs, and outlived every single one of her enemies. By the time she died in 1744, she was one of the wealthiest women in England, still bitter, still brilliant, and still entirely convinced she'd been right about everything. It's the aristocratic version of logging off and living well. The Austrian approach, quiet, guilt-ridden, and bureaucratic. Meanwhile, in Austria, things were far less flamboyant. The Habsburgs, who had already perfected the art of dynastic inbreeding, treated mistresses like administrative accidents. They existed, of course, particularly under Emperor Joseph II and Francis I, but they were never celebrated. When the emperor died, his mistress was expected to disappear, ideally to a convent, or failing that, a discreet countryside manor where no one would ever mention her again. One mistress of Leopold I, for instance, was granted a small pension for services rendered, which is possibly the coldest phrase in romantic history. It was all handled with paperwork and silence, which, in Habsburg fashion, was both depressing and efficient. Mistresses versus queens, the posthumous rivalries. One of the quietest dramas in history happens after royal funerals. The queen is the official widow, draped in black and publicly adored. The mistress, meanwhile, becomes a ghost, unwelcome but unforgettable. Sometimes, queens went out of their way to erase those memories. Sometimes, they couldn't resist keeping the old rival's name alive, if only to hate her more thoroughly. Take Catherine de Medici, who wore black for years after Henry II's death, but somehow found time to redecorate the Louvre with subtle symbols mocking Diane de Poitiers. Or Maria Theresa of Spain, who tolerated her husband's mistresses in silence, but left behind letters dripping with quiet fury. There was no real closure in these stories. From beds to books, the rebranding of scandal. By the 18th century, the role of royal mistress had shifted. It wasn't just about romance anymore, it was a career path. Women like Madame de Pompadour treated it almost like a diplomatic post. And when they aged out of favor, they pivoted gracefully, turning to art, philanthropy, or education. It was the earliest form of image rehabilitation. After all, you couldn't exactly open a shop or move to the suburbs. Your name was already attached to 1,000 whispered stories. So, the smarter mistresses learned to control the narrative. Pompadour's salons became centers of Enlightenment thought. Madame de Maintenon turned moralist. Even Du Barry, before the guillotine ruined her brand, was trying to play the charitable widow role. It's a little tragic, but also impressive. Centuries before social media, these women understood the art of the soft rebrand. Let's float to England again, and meet a mistress who outlived everyone. Now, over in England, the mistress game was less glittering, more domestic. Take Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, not technically a royal mistress, but close enough in influence to count. She was the favorite and lifelong friend of Queen Anne, whose affection for her bordered on romantic. Sarah was powerful, loud, and not remotely subtle about it. She controlled access to the Queen, arranged appointments, and ran the court like it was her own house. When the relationship soured, as royal affections do, Sarah was dismissed, disgraced, and replaced. But she didn't vanish. She lived there for 4 years, in peace, teaching and praying, far from Versailles. And when she died, she left behind letters that revealed a woman who had loved power, but loved peace more. It's rare to find a royal mistress who got both. Diane de Poitiers, too beautiful to bury. Let's float backward in time a bit, to another French royal affair, the Renaissance era, where things were even more awkwardly glamorous. King Henry II of France was married to Catherine de' Medici, an Italian princess who brought fine culture, bad luck, and endless political anxiety to the French throne. But from the very beginning, Henry was obsessed with someone else, Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years his senior. Diane had known Henry since he was a child, which sounds worse the more you think about it, and she became his lifelong companion, advisor, and lover. She was elegant, athletic, and cultivated. She even wore black and white, Henry's colors, every day. At court, she was untouchable. Catherine de' Medici, his actual wife, seated in the background, forced to smile politely as Diane received jewels and estates. Then, in 1559, Henry died in a bizarre jousting accident. Catherine finally saw her chance. Within weeks, she banished Diane from court, seized her chateau, and took back the royal jewels, including a particularly extravagant pearl necklace. Diane, ever the graceful realist, retreated to her estates and lived out her years quietly. She was left alone, respected, but exiled. And centuries later, when her tomb was opened, the world discovered that even in death, she had refused to fade. Her remains showed signs of having ingested large amounts of gold throughout her life, part of a then popular elixir of youth. Ironically, it probably killed her. But at least she died glowing. Hey again. Still awake? Barely? Good. Because we're now in the twilight years of the royal bedchamber, that faint candlelight flicker that happens after the king is gone, when everyone suddenly pretends they didn't know who you were. Tonight we're following a few of the rare survivors. The women who didn't just vanish after the crown changed heads, they adapted, disguised, or, occasionally, won. They're the ghost voices of old courts, once whispered about, now politely ignored in history books. So, let's start with one of the cleverest of them all. Madame de Maintenon, the mistress who became a queen, sort of. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was not known for moderation. He had mistresses the way other men had hats, and he wore them with the same flourish. But one of them, Madame de Maintenon, was different. She wasn't beautiful. She wasn't scandalous. And she didn't start out as anyone's idea of royal material. She was the governess to the king's illegitimate children, the ones he'd had with his earlier, far more glamorous mistress, Madame de Montespan. You'd think that would be an awkward household dynamic. And yes. It was. But somewhere between arithmetic lessons and court gossip, the widowed governess quietly became the king's companion, and eventually, his secret wife. When Louis XIV's official queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, died in 1683, the Sun King finally married Maintenon in a private ceremony. It wasn't recognized publicly, but everyone knew. She never had the title of queen, only the influence. She reigned behind the curtains, urging piety and restraint in a court built entirely on vanity. When Louis died in 1715, Maintenon did something unheard of for a former mistress. She retired, quietly, voluntarily, to the school she had founded for noble girls, the Maison Royale de St. Louis in St. Cyr. Under Catherine the Great, mistresses weren't just tolerated, they were practically a department of government. Catherine rewarded her lovers with titles, land, and sometimes palaces, before gently dismissing them with pensions when she grew bored. But when the tables turned, when a powerful male monarch died, those rewards tended to evaporate fast. The Russian system didn't just forget mistresses. It erased them. Catherine's own predecessor, Peter III, had mistresses who vanished into exile once she took the throne. And her later favorites, like Grigory Potemkin, only survived because they were smart enough to die in her favor, not outlive her. By the 19th century, the Russian Empire had turned mistress management into an art form, reward them richly, silence them swiftly. It was practically a job rotation. The pattern repeats, always the same. No matter the country, France, England, Spain, Russia, the story rhymed. The mistress rose with the king and fell with him. She was blamed for his vices, envied for her jewels, and forgotten the moment the crown passed on. Some escaped with pensions, others with memories. A few ended up in exile, or worse, in history's polite footnotes. Their portraits still hang in galleries, elegant, mysterious, unnamed. And somewhere in the brushstrokes, you can almost see the moment they realized that love, in royal circles, had a very short shelf life. Let's stay in this sleepy royal orbit for a bit longer, because in the next stretch, we'll float through the successor years, how new queens handled their late husbands' mistresses, how politics rewrote romance, and how a few clever women actually managed to turn widowhood into power. It's a quiet, glittering afterlife, the ghost of the royal bedchamber, still echoing after the king was gone, the afterlives of scandal, mistresses who outlasted the crown. The Habsburg kings, famous for their jawlines and unfortunate genetics, generally kept their affairs discreet. But by the 18th century, with the arrival of the Bourbon dynasty from France, things got livelier. King Philip V, for instance, was so religious and melancholy that he could barely function without his wife, until she died, and he fell into depression so deep he barely left his bed. His next queen basically acted as both spouse and nurse. There was no mistress here, just exhaustion. But his son, Ferdinand VI, had a bit more spark. His mistress, Maria Barbara de Braganza, actually became his wife, proving that occasionally, in royal circles, you could promote yourself from mistress to queen. Though it usually required someone else to die first. The Bourbon pattern, affairs as policy. By the time we reach Charles III of Spain, things have become politely French again. Mistresses were tolerated as long as they didn't embarrass anyone. The Spanish version of the Mistresses came with less glitter and more guilt. These women were often married to courtiers, forming quiet arrangements that everyone pretended not to notice. And when the king died, they were usually sent to convents. Spain loved that solution, it looked merciful and moral, while neatly removing any potential for gossip. Imagine spending years in silk and lace, then ending up gardening with nuns. You'd almost hope for a guillotine at that point. Russia's royal romances, love, power, and inevitable exile. Now, let's float northeast, to Russia, where everything was colder, larger, and slightly more fatal. The Russian imperial court turned mistress culture into high political theater. Tsars and tsarinas alike had favorites, and the consequences were dramatic. When Edward died, she was stripped of her property and banished from court. The chroniclers called her greedy and immoral, which, to be fair, was basically the job description. She lived in obscurity afterward, which in medieval England was probably the best she could hope for. A few centuries later, Barbara Villiers' great-granddaughter, Henrietta Howard, would become mistress to George II, a man who made up for his lack of charm with sheer predictability. Henrietta was polite, witty, and deeply bored. She endured years of court politics before retiring to a country estate once she realized she'd reached the peak of her usefulness. She outlived everyone, including the queen who had hated her. Which, honestly, feels like the best revenge possible. The job description no one wanted to write down. Across Europe, being a royal mistress was both a privilege and a trap. You got luxury, but no legitimacy. Influence, but no safety. Everything depended on one man's affection, and on how quickly someone younger or more interesting could take your place. And when the king died, that affection evaporated into politics. New regimes couldn't afford reminders of the old king's indulgences. Mistresses were inconvenient. They knew too much. They owned too much. And sometimes, they looked too good in portraits to be forgotten gracefully. Let's float over to Spain, where scandal was subtly Catholic. Now, if you think the French and English had drama, let's drift quietly over to Spain. Spanish courts were far more rigidly Catholic, meaning public mistresses were officially frowned upon, which only made the private ones more interesting. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the English had their own way of mishandling mistresses. They never made it an official court position, it was all private arrangement and gentle discretion. Which sounds nice until you realize it meant the women were entirely unprotected. Let's start with the Restoration era, where discretion was not exactly King Charles' strong suit. The merry monarch's merry mess. Charles II reigned from 1660 to 1685, and he made up for the Puritan years of Oliver Cromwell by turning his court into one long party. He had many mistresses, many. The two most famous were Barbara Villiers, who specialized in being glamorous and terrifying, and Nell Gwynn, who specialized in being funny and charmingly lower class. Barbara was beautiful, scandalous, and relentless. She used her influence to secure titles and wealth not only for herself but for her many children, several of whom she insisted were the king's, with varying degrees of plausibility. When Charles died, Barbara was prepared. She had land, money, and enough blackmail material to keep herself comfortable. She lived on, fiery and bitter, dying in luxury but unloved. Nell Gwynn, on the other hand, was the Cinderella of mistresses, witty, kind, and genuinely adored by the public. She begged the dying Charles to "let not poor Nellie starve," and to his credit, he told his brother and successor, James II, to make sure she didn't. Miraculously, James kept his word. Nell lived quietly afterward, dying of illness a few years later. Her funeral was well attended, which, for an actress-turned-mistress, was a small miracle of respectability. So yes, not everyone ended badly, but that was mostly luck. The unlucky ones, England's forgotten favorites. Most English mistresses weren't as fortunate. Take Alice Perrers, mistress to Edward III in the 14th century. She was clever, ambitious, and unpopular, mostly because she got rich while everyone else got the plague. And yet, for all the satin and splendor, it was still a role that vanished the second a heart stopped beating. Take Madame de Pompadour, the famous favorite of King Louis XV. She was charming, witty, politically savvy, basically the HR department of Versailles. She arranged appointments, influenced foreign policy, even planned royal architecture. And yet, she died before the king, which was honestly the best possible outcome for her career. Because when Louis himself finally went, his last mistress, Madame du Barry, didn't fare nearly as well. Madame du Barry, from diamonds to the guillotine. Madame du Barry was everything a late Bourbon mistress wasn't supposed to be: beautiful, uneducated, and scandalously from the lower class. Louis XV adored her. The court despised her. She was blamed for the king's laziness, his spending, and the general moral decay of Versailles, which, to be fair, had been decaying since about 1682. When Louis XV died of smallpox in 1774, du Barry's entire world disintegrated overnight. The new king, Louis XVI, and his fresh, moralistic queen, Marie Antoinette, wanted nothing to do with their late predecessor's mistress. Within days, du Barry was banished from Versailles. Her jewels were confiscated, her carriages repossessed, and she was sent to live quietly in a convent. Imagine going from royal balls to morning prayers with nuns who definitely knew who you were. She did eventually return to society, but not for long, because when the French Revolution came knocking, no one cared that she was no longer in favor. Her reputation as a symbol of royal excess made her an easy target. In 1793, Madame du Barry was guillotined, weeping, begging for her life, and allegedly crying, "Encore un moment, Monsieur le Bourreau, just one more moment, Mr. Executioner." The crowd, apparently, wasn't feeling generous. So yes. For royal mistresses, dying first was the ideal career move. English royalty, a bit more discreet, but just as. What happened to royal mistresses when the king died? Hey guys. Tonight, we're stepping softly into the quieter corners of royal history, the ones lined with silk curtains, scandal, and uncomfortable silences after funerals. So, dim the lights, settle in, maybe pour yourself something a little decadent, because tonight we're asking one of history's most awkward questions. What happened to royal mistresses when the king died? Because it's easy to picture them in the glamorous years, the jewels, the palaces, the whispered gossip in candlelit corridors. But the morning after the crown changes heads. That's when the music stops. And suddenly, the women who once ruled from the shadows find themselves standing very much in the light, and not always kindly. A nation's second widows. Royal mistresses were a fascinating contradiction. They had no title in law, but enormous power in practice. They were the second most important woman in the kingdom, after the queen, of course, who usually hated them. But when a king died, that delicate balance of influence collapsed instantly. One day, you're the king's dearest friend. The next, you're a state embarrassment with suspicious jewelry and nowhere to live. Most of them didn't even get to mourn publicly. The new monarch, often a son or nephew, had every reason to erase the memory of his father's private life. Mistresses were removed from court, their portraits taken down, their letters archived, which is the polite historical term for burned immediately. So tonight, let's take a slow walk through a few royal courts, and meet the women who learned the hard way that love with a monarch comes with an expiration date. The French, naturally, were the professionals. We have to start in France, because no country made royal mistressing such an art form. The French even had a title for it, maîtresse en titre, meaning official mistress. It was a recognized position at court, often with apartments, pensions, and staff.